When Japanese naval intelligence first catalogued the Douglas SBD Dauntless, they filed it under obsolete types, minimal threat priority. The dive bomber's maximum speed of 250 miles per hour seemed laughable compared to Japanese fighters cruising at 330 miles per hour. Its fixed landing gear and bulky profile violated every principle of modern aircraft design. Then came Midway. In 5 minutes, SBD Dauntless dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and eliminated Japan's naval aviation dominance forever. What followed was a desperate Japanese reassessment mixing disbelief, fear, and ultimately profound respect for an aircraft that shouldn't have mattered but became their worst nightmare. In early 1942, Japanese naval aviation dominated the Pacific with aircraft representing the cutting edge of carrier-based design. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber could reach 267 miles per hour, featured retractable landing gear, and embodied Japanese design philosophy emphasizing speed and maneuverability. When intelligence photographs of American SBD Dauntless operations reached Tokyo, analysts noted the fixed landing gear, low speed, and chunky fuselage with dismissive commentary. The cognitive dissonance was immediate. Japan's Doctrine prioritized aircraft that could outrun and outmaneuver opponents, making the Dauntless appear to be a transitional design that America would surely replace with something modern once proper dive bombers entered production, not realizing the Americans had deliberately chosen these characteristics for reasons Japanese aviation philosophy couldn't comprehend. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's staff prepared threat assessments ranking American carrier aircraft by danger level. The SBD received the lowest rating among combat types. Intelligence officers calculated that Japanese fighters could easily intercept the slow dive bombers before they reached attack positions, while anti-aircraft fire would devastate formations that couldn't maneuver aggressively. The math seemed irrefutable. An aircraft cruising at 250 miles per hour attacking ships defended by fighters traveling 80 miles per hour faster should result in catastrophic American losses. Yet the assessments failed to account for how dive bombing tactics, aircraft durability, and pilot training could overcome raw speed disadvantages through factors Japanese analysts had systematically undervalued. Japanese pilots who'd encountered SBDS during early Pacific operations reinforced these dismissive attitudes. The bombers seemed easy prey when intercepted, lumbering targets that couldn't escape pursuing Zeros. Several were shot down during Coral Sea engagements, confirming Japanese assumptions about vulnerability. Nobody recognized that the SBDS reaching their targets despite losses represented remarkable effectiveness rather than lucky survival, and that the damage they inflicted on Japanese carriers during these early battles provided warning signals Japanese command structure systematically ignored because the warnings contradicted comfortable assumptions about American aviation inferiority. But first, combat would shatter every assumption about what slow meant. On June 4, 1942, at approximately 10:20 a.m., Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu operated in perfect weather with clear visibility, recovering aircraft from the morning strike on Midway Island. Flight decks were crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. Then 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. Within 5 minutes, 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks shattered by 1,000-pound bombs that penetrated to hangar spaces where aviation fuel and armed ordnance created secondary explosions that doomed each ship, the speed of destruction so complete that Japanese damage control procedures designed to save ships from torpedo and bomb damage proved utterly inadequate against the concentrated devastation dive bombing delivered. Japanese survivors described a nightmare scenario. The SBDs appeared at 14,000 feet without warning. Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level chasing torpedo bombers. The dive bombers rolled into near-vertical dives, screaming down at 280 miles per hour in dives where their obsolete fixed landing gear actually provided additional dive brakes for stability. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves unable to track targets plummeting vertically at speeds exceeding horizontal maximum velocity, their fire control systems calibrated for level bombers or shallow glide attacks, not aircraft diving at 70-degree angles, where traditional deflection shooting became geometrically impossible, forcing gunners to fire blindly upward, hoping for lucky hits against targets they couldn't properly track. The accuracy stunned Japanese analysts reviewing post-battle reports. American dive bombers achieved hit rates exceeding 50%. 4 bombs hit Akagi, 3 struck Kaga, 3 hit Soryu. Japanese Doctrine assumed 10 to 15% hit rates from dive bombing attacks. The discrepancy wasn't luck, but systematic American superiority in dive bombing technique, pilot training, and bomb sight technology that Japanese intelligence had failed to recognize, creating a tactical surprise where the weapon Japan dismissed as obsolete proved more effective than any naval weapon system they possessed for destroying heavily defended capital ships. Yet Japan's true nightmare wasn't the battle itself, but what they discovered afterward. Post-Midway intelligence collection revealed uncomfortable truths about SBD construction that Japanese engineers found baffling. American dive bombers absorbed battle damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft and continued flying. The SBD's all-metal stressed skin construction with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating protecting the crew, and redundant control systems created survivability margins. Japanese dive bombers completely lacked, allowing American aircraft to return from missions with battle damage that would have killed Japanese crews, creating cumulative advantages where experienced American pilots survived to fly again, while Japanese aviators died in fragile aircraft that sacrificed durability for performance. The Aichi D-3A that Japanese pilots considered superior flew faster and maneuvered better than the Dauntless, but its lightweight construction meant a single 20mm cannon hit could prove fatal. Japanese design philosophy emphasized offensive capability over defensive survivability. Assuming air superiority would protect dive bombers from interception, but Pacific combat demonstrated that even with fighter superiority, some enemy fighters always penetrated defenses, meaning every Japanese bomber mission risked losing irreplaceable experienced crews to damage that American aircraft routinely survived. Captured SBD wreckage underwent systematic analysis at Japanese technical facilities. Engineers discovered armor plating thickness exceeding anything in Japanese dive bombers, fuel tank sealing systems they couldn't replicate with available materials, and structural reinforcement that added weight but provided crash survivability. One recovered SBD showed evidence of surviving 13 separate bullet and shell fragment hits, damage that would have disintegrated a D-3A in flight, forcing Japanese engineers to acknowledge that American willingness to sacrifice speed for durability represented a valid design philosophy they'd dismissed as indicating inferior engineering rather than different operational priorities. The durability advantage compounded over months. American squadrons retained experienced crews who'd survived multiple combat missions. Japanese squadrons suffered constant attrition as veterans died in aircraft that couldn't protect them. By late 1942, average American SBD crew experience exceeded Japanese D-3A crews by 200+ combat hours, creating skill gaps that widened catastrophically as the war progressed. Japanese engineers studied the wreckage obsessively, discovering uncomfortable truths. Japanese naval aviation studied American dive bombing techniques obsessively after Midway, trying to understand how SBD crews achieved hit rates that Japanese pilots couldn't match. The answer proved both simple and impossible to replicate: training, equipment, and doctrine. American dive bomber pilots received 18+ months of training, including hundreds of practice dive bombing runs before carrier qualification, while Japanese training by 1942 had been compressed to 6 to 8 months with minimal live ordnance practice due to fuel and ammunition shortages, creating experience gaps where American pilots had internalized dive bombing to instinctual levels while Japanese crews were still learning fundamentals. The SBD's perforated dive brakes allowed precise dive angle control that Japanese aircraft couldn't match. American pilots dove at consistent 70-degree angles at consistent speeds, making their bombsight calculations reliable. Japanese dive bombers lacked comparable dive brakes, forcing pilots to vary dive angles and speeds to avoid overstressing airframes, introducing variables that made accurate bombing nearly impossible even for experienced crews. While the SBD's stable dive characteristics meant even average pilots could achieve accuracy that Japanese aces struggled to replicate, American bombsight technology provided another advantage Japanese intelligence underestimated. The Norden bombsight adapted for dive bombing gave SBD crews superior target tracking. Japanese optical sights were simpler and required more pilot skill to compensate for wind, target movement, and aircraft motion, meaning American equipment advantages multiplied training advantages, creating compounding superiority, where better tools in better trained hands produced results. Japanese aviation couldn't match regardless of pilot courage or determination. The statistical reality was devastating. American SBD squadrons achieved 40 to 50% hit rates against maneuvering targets throughout 1942 to 1943. Japanese dive bombers managed 10 to 15% under similar conditions. The threefold accuracy advantage meant American squadrons could achieve mission objectives with 1/3 the aircraft, reducing exposure to defensive fire, while Japanese formations required larger numbers that presented more targets to defending fighters, creating tactical situations where American advantages multiplied through cascading effects. But accuracy advantages paled compared to tactical flexibility Japan never anticipated. Midway exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese carrier defense doctrine that the SBD exploited mercilessly. Japanese carriers relied on combat air patrol fighters to intercept threats before they reached attack positions, but American tactics systematically defeated this approach. Torpedo bombers attacked at sea level, drawing Japanese fighters downward. Then SBD dive bombers attacked from altitude while defenders were out of position, a coordinated multi-axis attack doctrine that Japanese defense planning had never seriously considered because their own strike doctrine emphasized single-axis attacks that their defensive systems were optimized to counter. Japanese carriers lacked adequate anti-aircraft armament for defense against dive bombing attacks. Most anti-aircraft guns were light-caliber weapons effective against level bombers, but inadequate against near-vertical dives. The geometric problem proved insurmountable. Guns positioned to fire horizontally at approaching aircraft couldn't elevate enough to track vertical dives, while guns positioned to fire upward couldn't traverse fast enough to track diving aircraft moving at 280+ miles per hour, creating blind spots that dive bombers exploited by attacking from angles Japanese defensive systems literally couldn't cover. Damage control procedures failed catastrophically against dive bombing damage patterns. Japanese carriers stored aviation ordnance and fuel in locations optimized for rapid aircraft turnaround, not survivability against penetrating bomb hits, meaning successful strikes triggered cascading secondary explosions that damage control teams couldn't contain, while American carriers separated fuel storage, ammunition magazines, and incorporated better compartmentalization that allowed them to survive similar hits that would sink Japanese carriers. The defensive crisis forced desperate measures. Japanese carriers increased anti-aircraft armament, implemented better combat air patrol tactics, and revised damage control procedures. But fundamental limitations remained. Japanese carrier doctrine was offensive-focused, optimized for striking first with overwhelming force, assuming battles would be decided by whoever launched attacks first, rather than whoever defended better. A philosophy the SBD's effectiveness proved dangerously flawed. The defensive crisis revealed deeper problems with Japanese aviation philosophy. By late 1942, Japanese naval aviation began attempting to replicate SBD tactics and capabilities. The Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber entered production with specifications addressing perceived SBD advantages: higher speed, better defensive armament, and improved dive characteristics. But Japanese industry couldn't replicate the durability that made the SBD effective. The D-4Y used lightweight construction that made it faster but fragile, proving that Japanese engineers understood what made the Dauntless successful but lacked materials and manufacturing capacity to implement similar designs, forcing compromises that produced aircraft with SBD-like capabilities on paper but catastrophic vulnerability in actual combat. Training reforms attempted to improve Japanese dive bombing accuracy through intensive practice and better bomb sights. Fuel shortages prevented implementation. By 1943, Japanese pilot training had deteriorated further as experienced instructors died in combat and aviation fuel became too precious to waste on training exercises, creating an impossible situation where Japanese naval aviation recognized they needed better trained dive bomber crews but lacked resources to provide the training, while American training programs expanded and improved as industrial capacity provided unlimited fuel and ordnance for practice. Japanese tactical doctrine evolved to incorporate multi-axis attack concepts the SBD had demonstrated. Coordinated strikes using torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters attacking simultaneously from different vectors became standard planning. But executing complex coordinated attacks required extensive training and experienced crews that Japanese aviation increasingly lacked, meaning tactical innovations existed on paper but couldn't be implemented effectively in combat, while American squadrons refined coordinated tactics through constant practice and combat experience that Japanese crews never gained. The most telling sign of respect came in Japanese pilot diaries and after-action reports. By 1943, encountering SBD Dauntless formations merited special mention and heightened caution. Pilots who dismissed the dive bomber as easy prey in 1942 described it in 1943 to 1944 as a dangerous opponent requiring careful approach and overwhelming force to counter effectively, demonstrating how combat experience forced revision of initial dismissive attitudes. By 1944, the SBD had become something Japan feared more than technology. The SBD Dauntless's greatest impact on Japanese naval aviation was psychological rather than purely material. After Midway, Japanese carrier crews operated with constant awareness that American dive bombers could appear without warning and destroy their ships within minutes. This anticipatory dread affected every aspect of carrier operations: positioning decisions, launch timing, combat air patrol management, even basic morale, as crews understood that regardless of how well they performed their duties, a handful of SBD dive bombers breaking through defenses could kill thousands of men and destroy billions of yen worth of irreplaceable naval assets in seconds. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized offensive action, but SBD effectiveness forced defensive caution. Carriers remained further from combat zones, reducing aircraft range and effectiveness. Combat air patrol strengths increased at the expense of strike capability, dedicating more fighters to fleet defense rather than offensive missions, fundamentally altering Japanese naval aviation's offensive character and forcing resource allocation decisions that weakened striking power to protect assets from the dive bomber threat the SBD represented. The confidence that had defined Japanese naval aviation in 1941 to early 1942 evaporated. Pilots who'd considered themselves invincible after early victories against unprepared opponents discovered that properly employed American equipment and tactics could devastate Japanese forces. The SBD became symbolic of this shift. An aircraft Japanese intelligence dismissed as obsolete proved more effective at destroying capital ships than any weapon in Japan's arsenal, forcing painful recognition that American aviation wasn't inferior, but differently optimized, and that Japanese assumptions about technological and tactical superiority were propaganda rather than reality. By war's end, the SBD had sunk more Japanese shipping tonnage than any other Allied aircraft type. 6 carriers, numerous cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels fell to its 1,000-pound bombs. But its true legacy was destroying the psychological foundation of Japanese naval aviation dominance, proving that courage and skill couldn't overcome systematic American advantages in training, equipment, and doctrine that turned an obsolete dive bomber into Japan's carrier-killing nightmare. Japan's SBD assessment evolved from dismissive contempt to fearful respect as the slow, obsolete dive bomber systematically destroyed their carrier fleet. The Dauntless proved that modern warfare rewards effectiveness over elegance, durability over speed, and training over raw performance. Japanese aviation learned too late that underestimating opponents based on specifications rather than capabilities costs wars. Watch the next video for more untold aviation stories.